There are certain moments in astrology that feel less like ordinary transits and more like a doorway opening beneath your feet. The kind of moment where you suddenly realize the version of reality you have been standing inside is no longer stable. And I need you to pay close attention, because what is approaching on May 6th is not quiet energy. It is not passive, and it is definitely not something you move through unchanged. Pluto, the planet tied to buried truths, control, obsession, psychological transformation, and hidden power, is preparing to station retrograde in Aquarius. And I honestly do not think most people understand the magnitude of what that actually means. This is not the kind of transit that politely taps on the surface of your life. This is the kind of force that tears through illusions you have depended on, emotionally, mentally, and even spiritually. It drags hidden motives into the light. It exposes what has been manipulated behind the scenes. It forces confrontation with the parts of your reality you kept postponing because facing them would change everything. And what feels most intense about this is that the process has already begun before the official retrograde even arrives. You may have already noticed it without fully understanding why. There has been this strange emotional pressure building beneath ordinary moments, almost like your intuition has become louder than your logic. Thoughts you tried to suppress keep returning. Certain conversations suddenly feel emotionally loaded. Situations you once ignored no longer feel easy to dismiss. That is not random. That is the atmosphere shifting before the storm fully arrives. The energy is already moving through people right now. And if you have felt like something hidden is trying to rise into your awareness, there is a reason for that feeling. Your inner world is responding to a deeper collective movement that is accelerating beneath the surface. And for 3 specific zodiac signs, this period becomes even more personal because this retrograde is preparing to activate what can only be described as a direct confrontation with power itself, not the performance of power, not the illusion of control, but the raw truth of where your energy has been given away, manipulated, hidden, or denied. Later, those signs will become clear, but before any of that unfolds, there is something happening today that changes the entire emotional landscape of this transit. And strangely, almost nobody is talking about it, even though it explains why everything already feels different. Today is the point where the seal begins to break. Today is where silence becomes unstable. Today is where the hidden pressure finally starts leaking through the cracks. Most people assume Pluto retrograde begins the moment Pluto officially stations on May 6th. But that is not how these energies operate. Outer planets begin saturating the atmosphere long before the exact moment arrives, and on May 5th, the trigger becomes impossible to ignore because Mercury forms a square to Pluto. This 90-degree clash between the planet of communication and the planet of buried truth creates one of the most psychologically intense mental atmospheres imaginable. Mercury governs language, thoughts, information, perception, data, conversations, messages, and the way people process reality itself. Pluto governs shadow material, hidden motives, secrecy, manipulation, psychological control, buried desires, and everything concealed beneath appearances. When these two collide in a hard square, truth does not remain hidden for long. Information begins surfacing with force. Secrets lose stability. People reveal more than they intended. Conversations suddenly expose emotional undercurrents that were previously invisible. The atmosphere becomes heavy with meaning, and you may have already felt this happening over the last several days. Small talk feels almost impossible now because every interaction seems charged with emotional weight. Words land differently. Silences feel louder. People are speaking, but what you notice most is what exists underneath their words. There is tension beneath ordinary conversations, almost like everyone senses something deeper is happening, even if they cannot fully articulate it yet. And what makes this transit even more powerful is the contrast between the signs involved. Mercury is moving through Taurus, grounding the mind into themes connected to money, survival, physical reality, stability, resources, possessions, and tangible security. Pluto is moving through Aquarius, the sign connected to collective systems, technology, digital networks, social structures, artificial intelligence, and the invisible frameworks shaping society from behind the scenes. When these worlds collide, hidden truths begin bridging the physical and digital realms simultaneously. On a collective level, this can manifest through exposed financial corruption, leaked information, technological scandals, revelations connected to data systems, or hidden truths surrounding powerful institutions and digital infrastructures finally becoming visible. But personally, this energy becomes deeply intimate, because this is the kind of transit that uncovers things people hoped would stay buried forever. This is where suspicious patterns suddenly make sense. This is where hidden messages, unexplained financial activity, private conversations, emails, records, or evidence of betrayal surface in ways that can no longer be rationalized away. The emotional intensity of Mercury square. Pluto often creates obsessive thinking because the mind becomes consumed with uncovering what feels hidden. Thoughts repeat themselves. Questions refuse to disappear. You feel compelled to investigate, analyze, revisit details, and search beneath the surface for the missing truth. And while that intensity can feel overwhelming, there is a deeper psychological purpose unfolding beneath it, because sometimes transformation only begins when denial becomes impossible to maintain. Sometimes the soul becomes relentless because part of you already knows something important has been concealed for too long. So if your mind has felt unusually intense lately, if your intuition has become sharper, if you feel unable to stop questioning certain people or situations, it does not necessarily mean you are imagining things. It may actually be your psyche preparing for what Pluto Retrograde is about to uncover on a much deeper level. Because once Pluto stations on May 6th, the process moves beyond surface revelation and enters psychological excavation. And that is where this story becomes even more unsettling and strangely profound. At exactly 11:30 in the morning on May 6th, Pluto reaches a complete standstill at 5 degrees and 30 minutes of Aquarius before beginning its 5-month retrograde phase, and whenever an outer planet stations, the energy becomes extraordinarily concentrated because symbolically it is as though the planet stops moving entirely, focusing all of its force into one exact point in time. The atmosphere becomes impossible to ignore. Emotions intensify. Patterns become undeniable. Events begin carrying a feeling of fate around them. But what makes this particular station especially fascinating is the exact symbolic degree where it occurs. Pluto is stationing on the 6th degree of Aquarius, and within the Sabian symbol system, which assigns a symbolic image to every degree of the zodiac. This degree is represented by a masked figure performing ritualistic acts within a mystery play, and the deeper you sit with that image, the more unsettling it becomes. Because this retrograde is not only about secrets being exposed externally, it is about the masks people wear beginning to crack under pressure. It is about realizing how much of modern life has become performance, projection, identity construction, and emotional theater. It is about confronting the roles people play to maintain approval, power, control, or belonging. And as Pluto stations on this degree, something begins happening collectively and personally, where the mask can no longer remain fully attached. Hidden motives slip through. Carefully maintained identities begin weakening. People reveal who they truly are when pressure increases. And perhaps most importantly, you begin seeing yourself more clearly than before. Not the version designed for survival, not the version shaped by fear or expectation, but the version underneath all the emotional disguises you learned to wear. And once that process begins, there is no returning to unconsciousness, because the moment the mask starts coming off, everything changes. I want you to sit with that symbol a little longer, because the deeper you look at it, the more unsettling it becomes. A masked figure standing inside a ritual, acting out a role before a collective audience, hiding the real self beneath layers of costume and performance. And directly on this exact degree, Pluto begins its retrograde motion through Aquarius. That is not random symbolism. That feels like a direct message woven into the timing of this entire transit. Something hidden is reaching the point where it can no longer remain concealed. The identities people have constructed to survive emotionally, socially, and psychologically are beginning to fracture under pressure. The carefully maintained image, the personality crafted for approval, the version of self designed to maintain control over how others perceive you, all of it is starting to weaken. And what makes this even more powerful is understanding what a mystery play actually represented in ancient traditions. These were not casual performances created for entertainment. They were sacred acts. Participants wore masks so they could embody larger archetypal energies, forces connected to collective transformation, fear, death, rebirth, power, and spiritual evolution. The mask allowed someone to temporarily become something greater than their ordinary identity. But there is another side to that symbolism that feels impossible to ignore right now, because eventually a mask can stop being a tool and start becoming a prison. A role can stop serving growth and begin serving avoidance. And that is where this retrograde becomes deeply personal. Many people do not even realize how much of their life has been built around maintaining a version of themselves that no longer feels true. Some have spent years pretending to be strong while silently collapsing internally. Others have worn masks of independence to avoid vulnerability, masks of control to avoid fear, masks of perfection to avoid rejection, masks of detachment to avoid pain. At first, those identities may have protected you. They may have helped you survive difficult seasons, betrayal, abandonment, instability, or emotional chaos. But Pluto is not interested in survival strategies that keep you disconnected from your authentic self forever. Pluto tears through emotional architecture that has become dishonest, even when the dishonesty was unconscious. And this retrograde feels like the moment where the universe begins stripping away everything artificial with terrifying precision. The performance begins ending. The emotional scripts stop working. The masks no longer fit as comfortably as they once did. You begin realizing how exhausting it has become to constantly maintain an identity that no longer reflects who you truly are underneath. And perhaps even more shocking, you begin seeing the masks worn by everyone around you as well. Certain people become impossible to misread now. The energy beneath their words becomes visible. Manipulation becomes easier to detect. Hidden motives rise closer to the surface. Institutions, systems, and structures that once appeared stable begin revealing fractures beneath their polished exterior. Pluto retrograde does not simply expose external deception. It forces a confrontation with self-deception too. It asks the terrifying question most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Who are you when the role disappears? Who are you when there is nobody left to perform for? And that question becomes unavoidable once Pluto turns inward through retrograde motion, because the transformation stops focusing primarily on the outside world and begins descending directly into the psychological underworld within you. This is the part of Pluto retrograde that many people misunderstand. When Pluto moves direct, the energy often manifests externally through collective upheaval, collapsing systems, exposed corruption, changing power structures, and visible social transformation. But once Pluto stations retrograde, the excavation becomes internal. The battlefield shifts inward. The attention turns toward the hidden emotional terrain inside your own psyche. This is no longer about outward movement or external momentum. This is about descent. It is about entering the buried layers of yourself you've spent years avoiding because facing them would require real transformation instead of surface healing. And honestly, that process can feel deeply uncomfortable in the beginning, because Pluto does not operate gently. Pluto is not interested in temporary relief or cosmetic spiritual growth. Pluto goes directly to the root of things. It digs beneath behaviors, beneath coping mechanisms, beneath emotional defenses, until it reaches the original wound that created the mask in the first place. It uncovers the moment you learned it was safer to hide certain emotions. It uncovers the moment you decided vulnerability was dangerous. It uncovers the buried grief you never processed because survival demanded suppression. It uncovers the anger you swallowed to maintain peace. It uncovers the fear that shaped your choices without you realizing it. Over the next 5 months, Pluto Retrograde asks for radical honesty with yourself. Not performative honesty, not intellectual honesty, but emotional honesty so deep it changes your relationship with your own shadow. The rage buried beneath politeness begins surfacing. The grief hidden beneath numbness begins demanding acknowledgement. The trauma you tried to outrun emotionally circles back, because the psyche is finally ready to process what was once too overwhelming to face. And yes, that sounds heavy because it is heavy. Transformation at this level is never lightweight. But there is something profoundly liberating hidden inside this descent, because the moment you stop fearing your own shadow, it loses its power to control you unconsciously. The moment you stop rejecting pieces of yourself, those pieces stop sabotaging you from beneath the surface. The moment you reclaim the energy trapped inside fear, shame, grief, and suppression, your entire relationship with power changes. You stop performing strength and begin embodying it naturally. You stop seeking validation because your identity is no longer dependent on external approval. You stop living in survival mode because truth becomes more important than maintaining illusion. That is why this retrograde matters so much. It is not here to destroy you. It is here to remove everything false standing between you and your authentic power. So if you have been feeling unusually withdrawn lately, if solitude feels necessary, if you suddenly crave silence, introspection, distance from noise, or emotional processing, trust that instinct. This is not failure. This is not weakness. This is not you becoming disconnected from the world. This is preparation. Pluto retrograde often pulls people inward, because part of the transformation requires stepping away from performance long enough to hear your own truth clearly again. There are seasons where the soul needs retreat before rebirth. And right now, many people are entering exactly that kind of season. The external world may continue moving rapidly, but internally something much deeper is happening. The warriors are disappearing underground, not because they are defeated, but because they are sharpening themselves before the next stage begins. And for 3 specific zodiac signs, this process becomes especially intense because Pluto is directly targeting the foundations of their identity during this retrograde cycle. Taurus, Leo, and Scorpio, especially those with their sun, moon, or rising in these signs or planets positioned around 3 to 6 degrees, are standing directly inside this pressure field. Pluto currently sits at 5 degrees of Aquarius, and Aquarius belongs to the fixed modality. Taurus, Leo, and Scorpio are also fixed signs, which means this retrograde forms hard aspects that create relentless internal pressure. Fixed signs are known for stability, endurance, resistance, persistence, and emotional determination. These are the signs that hold the line when everything else collapses. They survive by maintaining structure. They resist sudden change because consistency creates safety for them psychologically. But Pluto does not negotiate with resistance forever. Eventually, it applies enough pressure that even the strongest emotional walls begin cracking. And that is why this retrograde becomes such a defining moment for these signs in particular, because the areas where they have been clinging most tightly are exactly the areas Pluto is preparing to transform most deeply. When a fixed sign finally reaches the point of transformation, it rarely happens quickly or gently. It feels more like pressure building beneath the earth for years before the fault line finally breaks open. The movement is slow at first, almost invisible, but underneath the surface something enormous is shifting, and once that shift begins, there is no stopping it. That is exactly the kind of energy surrounding May of 2026 for Taurus, Leo, and Scorpio. Because Pluto is no longer knocking politely at the door. Pluto is applying relentless pressure directly against the emotional structures these signs have depended on for stability, identity, and control. And what intensifies everything even more is the fact that Mercury and Mars are both moving through Taurus throughout this month, repeatedly activating these harsh, square aspects to Pluto in Aquarius. Mercury squared Pluto on May 5th, triggering the first wave of exposure, forcing truths, secrets, hidden motives, and psychological tensions into conscious awareness. Then later, on May 26th, Mars forms its exact square to Pluto, and that is when realization transforms into action. Mercury exposes. Mars acts. Mercury reveals the fracture. Mars decides whether you finally break the structure apart or continue suffering inside it. So for these fixed signs, this month is not ordinary timing. This is initiation energy. This is the kind of astrological threshold that divides life into before and after. The masks begin collapsing. The emotional performances stop functioning. The roles that once felt safe become unbearable to continue maintaining. And the deeper question, underneath all of this, becomes impossible to avoid. Are you going to continue clinging to structures that are already spiritually collapsing beneath you? Or are you finally willing to consciously dismantle what no longer reflects your truth and rebuild your life from a place that is actually real? Because that is what Pluto ultimately demands. Not perfection, not comfort, but authenticity. And once I truly understood how these planetary mechanics were operating together, especially the interaction between Pluto in Aquarius and the fixed sign squares coming from Taurus, it completely changed the way I viewed what these signs are about to experience. Taurus in particular is entering one of the most defining identity confrontations of this retrograde cycle. And if you are a Taurus listening right now, I need you to hear this carefully, because what is unraveling in your life may initially feel frightening, but it is also the doorway to your liberation. Pluto moving through Aquarius is activating your 10th house, the highest point of your chart, the area connected to career, public identity, reputation, achievement, visibility, authority, and the direction your life appears to be moving externally. Meanwhile, Mercury and Mars, moving through Taurus, are energizing your first house, the most personal part of the chart, your body, your sense of self, your identity, your instincts, your authentic nature beneath external expectations. And the tension between these two areas becomes almost unbearable during this retrograde, because it forces a confrontation between who you truly are and the version of yourself you have been presenting professionally to survive. The conflict becomes deeply personal. The image you project into the world no longer fits comfortably against the truth of what your soul actually wants. And the realization emerging beneath this pressure may be shocking, because many Taurus individuals are about to recognize that the path they have been climbing was never fully aligned with them to begin with. Some have spent years chasing security, financial validation, stability, social recognition, or external success without realizing how much fear was silently driving the entire structure. Fear of scarcity, fear of failure, fear of not being enough unless something visible could prove your worth. And Pluto retrograde has a way of exposing exactly where survival conditioning has replaced authentic purpose. As this transit deepens, hidden agendas within professional environments may suddenly become impossible to ignore. Workplace manipulation becomes clearer. Power struggles emerge from behind the scenes. Conversations reveal truths that were previously hidden beneath corporate politeness or strategic silence. Some Taurus individuals may uncover betrayal involving colleagues, authority figures, or professional systems they trusted. But for many, the most difficult realization will not involve other people at all. It will involve recognizing how long they have been performing success instead of genuinely living in alignment with themselves. That realization can feel devastating at first because Taurus does not build casually. Taurus invests deeply. Taurus sacrifices for long-term security. Taurus works tirelessly to create something stable and lasting. So when Pluto begins questioning the foundation itself, it can feel like the ground beneath your identity is suddenly becoming unstable. But what makes this such a powerful turning point is understanding that Pluto is not destroying your future. Pluto is exposing where your life became disconnected from your truth. And once you see that clearly, you gain the opportunity to consciously rebuild. That becomes your power moment, especially when Mars squares Pluto on May 26th, because suddenly the courage arrives to make decisions you may have feared for years. The courage to leave environments draining your spirit. The courage to stop performing a version of success designed only to impress others. The courage to redefine achievement according to what genuinely fulfills you, instead of what merely looks stable externally. There is an affirmation woven into this transit that feels especially important for Taurus during this retrograde cycle. My calling claims cosmic catharsis. And what that energy represents is the understanding that your authentic purpose is trying to break through the artificial layers surrounding it. The false structures are being cleansed because something more aligned is trying to emerge. So if things begin crumbling around your professional identity, do not immediately assume everything is falling apart. Sometimes collapse is simply the soul refusing to continue living inside something untrue. And as intense as this process becomes for Taurus, Leo is entering an equally powerful confrontation through an entirely different area of life. For Leo, Pluto moving through Aquarius is activating the 7th house, the domain connected to relationships, marriage, partnerships, collaborations, contracts, emotional mirrors, and the people closest to you. Meanwhile, the Taurus energy squares your 10th house of public image, reputation, ambition, and external identity. And because of that dynamic, the hidden truths surfacing for Leo revolve around the power structures operating inside relationships themselves. This is not surface-level relationship tension. This is exposure energy. This is the moment where the emotional masks inside your closest connections begin slipping off. You start recognizing dynamics that existed beneath the surface for much longer than you realized. Emotional manipulation disguised as care, control disguised as loyalty, financial dependence disguised as partnership, silent competition disguised as support. Some Leos may suddenly become aware of how much they have dimmed themselves emotionally to maintain peace within relationships that quietly depended on their self-suppression. Others may recognize how much of their identity has been shaped around keeping someone else comfortable at the expense of their own truth. And that realization can hit especially hard for Leo, because Leo naturally radiates identity, warmth, creativity, visibility, and self-expression. Yet under difficult relational dynamics, Leo sometimes learns to reduce their own light in order to avoid conflict, rejection, or emotional abandonment. Over time, that becomes exhausting because the authentic self slowly disappears beneath the role being performed for the relationship to survive. Pluto retrograde does not allow those dynamics to remain hidden anymore. The emotional truth underneath them rises to the surface whether people are ready for it or not. And once Leo sees clearly where power has become distorted inside relationships, There is no easy way to return to unconsciousness again. Leo, what makes this transit cut so deeply is that your heart naturally wants to believe in devotion. You are a sign that invests emotionally with enormous intensity once trust is established. You thrive when connection feels genuine, loyal, passionate, and emotionally expansive. You want relationships that feel alive, relationships that inspire pride, protection, warmth, and emotional certainty. So when Pluto begins exposing decay hidden beneath the surface of a partnership, it does not feel like an ordinary disappointment. It feels personal on the deepest level, because what is breaking apart is not only the relationship itself, but the emotional reality you built around it. And for many Leos, the painful realization emerging during this retrograde is not simply that another person was hiding something. It is that you may have been hiding from certain truths too. Sometimes, Leo keeps performing love long after authenticity has disappeared, because maintaining the image of loyalty feels safer than admitting the emotional foundation has changed. Sometimes the need to preserve harmony becomes stronger than the willingness to confront what no longer feels emotionally equal. But Pluto retrograde is not interested in preserving performances that no longer contain real emotional honesty. This transit forces relationships into truth. It forces hidden tensions upward. It forces conversations that have been emotionally postponed for years to finally erupt into the open. And with Mercury square Pluto already active, many Leos may notice explosive emotional exchanges surfacing suddenly, conversations loaded with years of resentment, buried frustration, jealousy, unspoken disappointment, or emotional imbalance, finally reaching the point where silence becomes impossible. It can feel overwhelming, because once these truths emerge, there is no easy way to return to the illusion that everything was fine. But strangely, this confrontation is necessary because nothing heals while it remains hidden beneath politeness and emotional avoidance. The soul cannot transform inside denial forever, and there is something profoundly empowering waiting for Leo on the other side of this process, because the moment you stop performing inside relationships, everything changes. The moment you stop needing to be worshipped and begin demanding emotional equality instead, you reclaim your sovereignty. The moment you stop shrinking yourself emotionally to preserve someone else's comfort, your authentic power returns. That becomes your defining breakthrough during this retrograde. Not proving your worth, not fighting for validation, but recognizing that real love does not require self-abandonment to survive. Real partnership strengthens identity instead of weakening it. Real connection amplifies your light instead of quietly depending on your dimming. And this is where Leo's natural leadership becomes essential, because your greatest strength during this transit is the courage to cut directly through emotional illusions. Pluto retrograde is teaching you to stop negotiating with dishonesty, even when the dishonesty is subtle. You begin recognizing projections more clearly. You begin seeing where certain relationships relied on imbalance instead of mutual truth. And if a relationship collapses under the weight of honesty, that truth may hurt initially, but it also reveals something important. Anything unable to survive authentic emotional transparency was never stable to begin with. There is an affirmation woven into this period that feels especially important for Leo during this retrograde cycle. Our oneness orchestrates authentic power, and the deeper meaning behind that energy is understanding that true partnership never demands the sacrifice of your individuality. Real love does not diminish your essence, it magnifies it. And Pluto retrograde is forcing you to recognize the difference between connection rooted in authenticity and connection rooted in emotional performance. As emotionally intense as this becomes for Leo, Scorpio is entering an even deeper underworld process connected to family, ancestry, and psychological inheritance itself. Scorpio has always carried a unique relationship with Pluto because Pluto is your modern ruler. In many ways, you understand transformation instinctively. You understand emotional death and rebirth in ways other signs often struggle to comprehend. You recognize darkness. You recognize survival. You recognize the strange alchemy that occurs when pain transforms into power. But even with that familiarity, this retrograde is not easy for you, because Pluto moving through Aquarius is activating your fourth house, the deepest foundation of the chart, the realm connected to home family systems, ancestry, emotional conditioning, childhood dynamics, inherited trauma, and the psychological roots that shaped your identity long before adulthood began. And the truths surfacing now are not surface-level revelations. They reach directly into the emotional architecture of your lineage itself. The hidden material emerging during this retrograde may involve family secrets, unresolved generational wounds, psychological manipulation normalized inside your upbringing, financial deception, betrayal, emotional control, hidden affairs, or painful truths about the people you trusted most during your formative years. And because Mercury and Mars are activating your seventh house of partnerships through these squares, the trigger for these revelations often arrives through another person, a partner. A close relationship or someone outside your family system may suddenly force you to confront emotional truths you'll spend years unconsciously avoiding. Certain dynamics inside your adult relationships may suddenly reveal direct connections to inherited emotional patterns from childhood. You may begin recognizing controlling tendencies, possessiveness, emotional distrust, hypervigilance, or survival mechanisms passed down through generations without anyone fully acknowledging them. And what feels especially powerful about this transit for Scorpio is understanding that the mask being removed is often connected to the idealized story you have carried about family itself. The version of your roots you emotionally protected because questioning it felt too destabilizing. But Pluto retrograde does not allow inherited illusions to survive indefinitely. It demands truth even when truth disrupts emotional loyalty. And while that process can feel brutal, Scorpio possesses an extraordinary gift during periods like this, because, unlike many signs, you are capable of walking directly into emotional darkness without turning away. You are capable of descending into the underworld of your own psyche and emerging transformed instead of destroyed. That is why this retrograde holds such enormous transformational potential for you. This is not simply about exposing pain. This is about ending cycles. This is about consciously breaking generational patterns that have silently shaped your emotional life for years. This is about refusing to continue carrying toxic emotional inheritance into the future. Pluto retrograde is giving you the opportunity to rebuild your emotional foundation on truth instead of survival conditioning. And when Mars, your traditional ruler, forms its square to Pluto later this month, the force of will available to you becomes immense. Suddenly, the emotional strength arrives to sever unhealthy attachments, confront difficult truths, establish boundaries, and create the emotional safety you may never fully received earlier in life. There is an affirmation moving through this transit for Scorpio that feels deeply aligned with the work unfolding now. My origins orbit original truth. And what that energy means is that your past does not imprison your future unless you continue unconsciously repeating it. You are not permanently defined by where you came from. You are rewriting the emotional story itself, and the courage required to do that is enormous, even for Scorpio. But this entire retrograde cycle is only the beginning of what is building, because the revelations surfacing now through Mercury square Pluto and Pluto's retrograde station are simply the opening phase. The next several weeks become a period of emotional processing, integration, psychological realization, and internal preparation. Then May 26th arrives, and the atmosphere shifts dramatically because Mars squares Pluto exactly. Mars governs action, aggression, confrontation, willpower, separation, survival instinct, and decisive movement. Pluto governs power, obsession, destruction, transformation, control, and buried force. When these two planets collide through harsh fixed sign tension, the energy becomes extraordinarily volatile. This is the moment where internal realization transforms into external action. People stop merely thinking about change and begin acting on it directly. Suppressed emotions erupt. Confrontations intensify. Power struggles become unavoidable. Ruthless competition emerges. Manipulation becomes more visible because individuals desperately attempt to maintain control over structures already beginning to collapse. And because fixed signs resist surrender so intensely, these confrontations can feel seismic once they finally break open.